Hello and welcome everyone. Today we will be taking a look at the MSI Aegis ZS pre-built gaming desktop. I was interested in testing this PC because I thought it would be a solid starting build for folks who wanted a machine that's decent enough to play modern games while retaining enough room for upgradability. Here are the specs of this particular system. For the CPU, we have an 8-core, 16-thread Ryzen 7 7700, 16 gigabytes of DDR5 memory clocked at 5600 megahertz. An NVIDIA RTX 4060 with 8 gigabytes of GDDR6 VRAM. This is MSI branded. An MSI Pro B650 Wi-Fi VC motherboard. A 650 watt PSU. A 1 terabyte NVMe storage. And all other parts, such as fans and coolers, are OEM MSI branded. Let's talk about the out-of-box experience. Upon opening the box, we are greeted with a single page of instructions on how to do the following. Remove the side glass panel, remove the packaging foam, checking the motherboard's power cables, which may come partially undone due to shipping, connecting your monitor, inserting the Wi-Fi antennas, and powering on the system with the power cable. The system also comes with a keyboard and mouse, both MSI branded. And finally, there's an accessory bag that contains miscellaneous items such as the power cable, Wi-Fi antennas, product help page, and an extra SATA cable which can be used for an addition of another SSD. Now onto the actual system. It seemed to be packed well with a lot of foam. The system also comes with a cloth cover, and as I was taking it off, we are presented with a dent on the side panels behind the motherboard, which was slightly bizarre, but honestly I didn't notice it, probably due to my excitement. This might have been from shipping, but it's hard to make a case for that since the glass panel was completely fine. Basically, if you applied a certain amount of pressure on one side, you'd also be doing the same on the other side, so I find it hard that the case metal bent during shipping and the glass was fine. This only means that the case probably was bent before it was shipped. And this is actually pretty common with some other pre-built reviews I've seen. To my surprise, there was also expandable foam packaging inside of the chassis. This is a nice to have as it does a decent job at keeping everything inside your case secure. After removing the expandable foam from the chassis, we are presented with its internal layout inside of the case. In front, there are 3 intake fans and there is a mesh ventilation front panel combined with a mesh filter on the fans themselves. This should prevent dust from accumulating in the system. And 1 outtake fan at the back, and a downdraft, down-firing CPU cooler. The downdraft cooler is especially good in this case because the motherboard doesn't seem to have VRM heatsinks, so the extra air being pushed down should provide adequate cooling for those parts. Here's what the I/O looks like on the back. There is a 2.5 gigabit Ethernet port, 2 USB-A's 3.1 Gen 2 ports, 4 USB-A's 3.0 ports, 1 USB-C 3.2 Gen 2 port, and your Wi-Fi antenna connectors along with a slew of audio ports. Let's talk about the initial boot and setup experience. Upon first boot, we are presented with the standard Windows out-of-box experience. I'm actually not a big fan of this because it forces you into signing into a Microsoft account. I usually bypass this with the Windows command line interface, and you can see me fiddling with that in the video. After bypassing this process, I decided to take a peek at the UEFI to get some context on some of the other hardware that would be a part of this system. The Amazon listing actually doesn't have much information beyond the CPU and GPU, so I wanted to get some insights on the RAM if XMP was enabled, and also see what model the motherboard would be. I didn't opt to change much while I was in there, so I just reset at that point and proceeded on to the Windows boot. The first thing I did when I booted into Windows was to make sure that my display settings were set to the maximum support refresh rate of my monitor, and to also check if NVIDIA drivers were installed. Once I got connected to Wi-Fi, I opted to run Windows updates, and there were quite a few that were needed to be installed. To be honest, this is expected, especially for a pre-built, ready-to-ship system. While that was going in the background, I decided to sign into my NVIDIA account, check the drivers, and to my surprise, NVIDIA Studio drivers were installed. I was a bit confused since this is a gaming build, so I would expect NVIDIA's gaming ready drivers to be installed, but instead, Studio drivers were installed. I had to configure that to be game ready drivers. I used DDU to do a clean reinstall of the NVIDIA drivers and opted to use game ready drivers this time. After the driver issue was sorted out, I popped back into the UEFI where I attempted to enable AXMP. This would allow the memory to run at its best rated speed and timings. I opted to use Profile 1, which increased the memory frequency to around 5600 MHz. After enabling that and verifying that it was running at the appropriate speed in Task Manager, I decided to check for bloatware. There was in fact bloatware installed. Not very surprising at this price point. The only thing that stood out to me at that point in time was Norton 360, so I opted to remove it. I then started to look into the motherboard itself. Like I mentioned before, the sale page mentions nothing about the motherboard model, so I needed to do some digging to find out what model it was and what version of the UEFI BIOS I was on. Now, the motherboard is an MSI Pro B650 VC Wi-Fi model. I believe that this is basically an OEM version of the MSI Pro B650P Wi-Fi. And on the surface, it seems like the only difference between the P version and the VC version is that the P version has heat sinks around the VRMs. If you scroll through the spec sheet side by side between the two models, everything pretty much looks the same. In terms of the BIOS version, it dated back to September of 2023. Unfortunately, I did not take note of the current version number, but I do remember the date it was released. It wasn't terribly out of date, given that this was filmed in early 2024. At that point, I opted to grab the latest version and perform the update myself. The update took some time, but it finished successfully. After it was done, I popped back in the UEFI once more to re-enable AXMP. Whenever you update your BIOS, it pretty much nukes all of the settings, so I needed to do this before doing any testing. Okay, so now we're on to the section of the video where most people probably care about, the benchmarks. So let's get right into it. A quick heads up here, but I've tested all of these games at both 1080p and 1440p resolutions. Kicking us off with the automated benchmarks, we're starting out with Assassin's Creed Mirage at 1440 high settings. Without any adaptive quality settings, I saw an average FPS at 87 with a 1% low of 62 FPS. At 1080p with similar settings, we saw a boost of up to 123 FPS average with a 1% low of 80 FPS. With Cyberpunk 2077 for 1440p at high settings, low ray tracing, and auto DLSS, I saw an average FPS of 68 and a 1% low of 60 FPS. At 1080p with similar settings, I saw an average of 86 FPS and a 1% low of 74 FPS. With Hitman 3 at 1440p medium settings, we got an average of 118 FPS and a 1% low of 95 FPS. At 1080p at the same settings, we get an average of 188 FPS and a 1% low of 145 FPS. Red Dead Redemption 2. At 1440p balanced settings, we got an average of 90 FPS with a 1% low of 76 FPS. And at 1080p with similar settings, we get an average of 119 FPS and a 1% low of 97 FPS. GTA 5. GTA 5 concludes the portion of the video with in-game automated benchmarks. For this title, the system pretty much ranged between 140 to 144 FPS at 1440p. GTA 5 has a weird issue with stutters if the FPS limit is unlocked, so I opted to keep it at 144 Hz, and it pretty much drove the frames up to that limit at 1440p very high settings, so I didn't bother testing at 1080p. I'm not sure why I included this title, but it's in the list of my own games, so I figured why not. For Valorant, with everything at high settings, I saw pretty similar FPS ranges for both 1440p and 1080p. Valorant is one of those games where the FPS deviations can be extreme depending on what is on screen at a given moment. Anyways, based on a few TDMs and a few ranked games, this system clocked in around 280 to 350 frames on average, noted by MSI Afterburner. With Fortnite at 1440p with mostly high settings and a few that were dialed back, we get an average of 135 FPS and a 1% low of 85 FPS. At 1080p with similar settings, we get a 200 FPS average and a 1% low of 100 FPS. And last but not least, 2018's God of War, which actually had a pretty tough time running on this hardware. This was a bit surprising. I chose a pretty fight-heavy scene to get an idea of its performance, and I found that the best way to play this game was to keep the graphical settings at the original preset, with a monitor resolution of 1440p, but with an internal resolution of 1080p. With these settings, I was able to get an average of 110 FPS and a 1% low of 95 FPS. This looks pretty good to me, but at this point, it seemed like both my VRAM and RAM buffers were running a bit high, which probably caused some slowdowns at 1440p. That concludes the gaming sections. I also wanted to include some productivity and synthetic benchmarks, so here they are. With Cinebench R23, we get a single core score of 1908 and a multi-core score of 17,971. With 3D Mark's Time Spy benchmark, we get an overall score of 11,000. I have left a link for the actual run in the description. So, now that we have done a brief overview of the system, we are faced with the question, should you buy this PC? Well, let's think about it. Currently, this system retails for $1,250 USD on Amazon, and I believe that this is currently the only place this system can be purchased from. I put together a comparable build with similar specs, and it came up to just over $1,000, $1,058 to be exact, and this is before taxes. If you'd like to save some money, by all means, I would recommend configuring something that works best with your budget. But I do know that there are some people who don't care too much about building it, and they just need something that works, and they just need that convenience. In this case, I think this PC is an okay choice. When I purchased it, there was a $100 discount, so I paid $1,150 before taxes. I think if you can catch a sale, it might be worth it. The good thing about this system is that the motherboard is built on the AM5 platform, and this just means that it will be compatible with AMD's next generation of CPUs, unlike the current LGA 1700 platform. So, there will be some room for upgradability, which will be quite nice. And so these are pretty much my overall thoughts. I'm sure there are better gaming PCs that you can find on PC Part Picker, and some of them may have older CPUs and potentially better GPUs. But with this build, part of the cost is the upgradability with AM5. I do wish that the 4060 came with at least 10 or 12 gigabytes of VRAM, so I do feel like the GPU is limited in this build. Because of this, I do think that it would be a performant 1080p system. 1440p gaming is possible, as I've laid out in the benchmarks portion, but as someone who prioritizes frames per second and performance over fidelity, I would take it as a 1080p focused system. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope this was helpful for anyone who's thinking about getting this system. Feel free to leave any questions about it in the comment section and I will try my best to answer them. Take care.